Thank you so much, Bob, for that generous introduction and for the note about my book, which we were talking about. I have unfortunately, no control over the price setting of the book and have often been a little embarrassed about the level at which university presses set book prices. But if you are interested in the book in other ways, just reach out to me and let me know. I'm putting in the chat right now a link to the Google slide deck that I'm going to share now on the screen. So you'll have that with you. Before I start, I want to thank Bob and Bill for the invitation to come and speak for the second time this week at this conference. I'm really excited about that. And it's not often that I get to talk about my book with listeners on the screen with me. So I'm excited about this conversation and what I will learn from it and from your questions. Nice. So I am going to share some remarks just to frame our conversation a little bit. And then we'll open it up for dialogue. So as you all know, the topic of this talk is Race Sounds, which is the name of the book, The Art and Pedagogy of Listening in the English Classroom. And if you are tweeting, if you could use the hashtags Race Sounds and Listening Pedagogy, as well as the hashtags for the conference, that would be great. Thank you all for being here. And I know that I can only see the panelists, but I do like to start my sessions and my classes with just a check-in to see how everyone's doing, especially now that we live in a remote connected world. And so if you could use this mood meter, it is 4 quadrants. And if you could find the word that best describes how you're feeling, how you're showing up right now, and the color of the quadrant in which that sits, and just note that for yourself. Doing exercises like this give us an opportunity to remember to listen to ourselves, right? We're often cued to listen for or to other people, but in order for us to do that fully, it makes sense and is important for us to take stock of how we are, to listen into ourselves. So as Bob shared, my name is Nicole Furlonge, and I am the director of the Klingenstein Center. I'm in my 3rd year of that work. And I'm also the co-founder of Learns Collaborative, which is a catalyzing think tank for change in schools and other organizations. On my mood meter, I would identify myself as yellow and thrilled to be here in this conversation. I also want to just share with you a few other things that aren't explicit in my bio, but really do come to frame the work that I do as an educator, but also the work that I do as a scholar, and certainly the topics that I took up in the book, Race Sounds. So I identify as Black and cisgendered, straight, and married. These are my 3 children here. And I mentioned off screen that we have a COVID puppy as well. I spent 25 years in boarding and day schools, teaching, coaching, running dorms, leading in various ways. I was public school educated, first gen to attend college. I'm biracial by birth and adopted, and my adopted parents were raised in the Jim Crow South. So I am a generation that's first generation removed from that experience. And I'm a writer and a scholar. So to Race Sounds, a book that started as my dissertation in graduate school and then developed into what you see here. These questions on the screen are the 3 main questions that drove me to think about listening for as long as I did in the ways that I did in the book, but also continue to compel me back to thinking about listening and thinking about the possibilities of listening in schools and for teaching. Still. So how might we cultivate ethical listening practices in a culture of excessive talk? I don't really think I need to explain that question. How might we think about listening as a democratic necessity? And how might we be better audiences for each other? So what do I mean by listening? So there are 2 main sort of keywords in this book that it's important to latch onto from the beginning. The first is hilisnan, which is an Old English word that means listening. In that word, hilisnan, is this understanding of listening as a stretching towards another. So the idea is that you listen from where you are, but listening is an act of stretching beyond yourself, listening towards another. And then logos is, in ancient Greek thought, the idea of logos is not just speech, which is typically what we take what we come to think of as speech in our current moment, but logos also included listening. And so for the ancient Greeks, there was a balance of logos, of listening and speaking in a democracy or in a citizenry. And if you could balance those two things, that it meant that you were more likely to have a healthy citizenry than not. So anytime you have an imbalance in that, if you have more talking without listening, then you're in trouble, right? So I often tell people that when we talk about and work with students around cultivating their voice, and we know that that's really important, that voice, it becomes a symbol for advocacy and agency. We know, though, that if we only develop voices, but we don't develop audiences for those voices, then we have shortchanged those voices. We have done a disservice to them and even harm. So those are two ideas around listening that I want you to sort of keep in mind as we go through the rest of this conversation. The misunderstandings about listening are that listening is passive. And as Helisnan and Logos illustrates, listening is far from passive. It's an active, intentional decision to reach out to another. Listening is all about the ear is another misunderstanding. So when I teach this class, I often ask, or when I've taught listening in class, I often ask students, point to the part of your body where listening happens. And they inevitably go here to the ear. And what we know about listening is that listening is a multimodal, full-bodied experience. In the book, I write about Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel, where the Invisible Man in the book talks about the ability and the desire to want to hear throughout the body through the vibrations of sound. And so listening isn't just what we can audibly take in, but it's also fully sensory in a number of different ways. Another misunderstanding is that if I listen to you, I agree with you, right? So I often catch myself saying to my kids, just listen to what I'm saying, which means just do what I'm asking you to do, right? But ultimately, what we mean by listening is that what I'm giving to you is not agreement. I'm not giving you my consensus. What I'm saying is that I'm making space for what you have to offer to me. And I'm sitting with that even when I don't agree with you, in order to have a true open dialogue or discussion after I listen. Listening needs audible sound is another misunderstanding, right? Again, it's not about the ear. Evelyn Glennie, who is a Scottish musician who is deaf, talks about her ability to hear through her body, again. But also when we go to talk about listening in literature in a few moments, we know that print is silent. It appears silent on the page. And so what does it mean to tune ourselves in to listen to silence? Something that we typically assume as no sound, but silence is itself its own sonic space. And then the last misunderstanding I want to call attention to is that voice, not listening, is essential to democracy and civic engagement. So in the United States, here, we're obviously to cast our votes. Some of us already have. And we often equate voting with voice, with having our voice heard. While that act is essential, very essential, at the is equally essential to being involved in a democracy and being given the spaces to be allowed to do so. So what I love about my book, Race Sounds, is that it joins a slew of books about listening and sound. But particularly these books are books that I'm highlighting in this article here, The Right to Listen at the bottom of the screen. I highlight these books because what I love about being a part of this canon, if I can call it that, is that these books take on the idea of sound studies and listening as being important to literary study. And they do so in a way that amplifies the idea that race is a key part of how we come to text and as listeners and as readers. And for those of you who know about reader response criticism, oftentimes the reader was very much situated as non-racial or even white-centered. And so these books, along with my own, really do the work of centering racial identity and identities writ large in terms of getting us to think about what we bring to the page, what we bring when we give audience to other people. I love, especially, I just read this one in Dylan Robinson's Hungry Listening. I'll talk about Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God in a minute, who talks about hungry listening. In Dylan Robinson's book, in Indigenous cultures, the notion of hungry listening is very different than the hungry listening that we see in African American literatures. So there's a counterpoint there that's really intriguing to me. The epigraph to my book comes from Citizen, which is by Claudia Rankin. All living is listening for throat to open, the length of its silent shaping lives. And I love that I was given, that Ms. Rankin gave me the permission to use this as my epigraph to my book, because what this passage amplifies for me is what is at stake when we listen and when we don't listen. And we know here, reminded in her book, reminded in the last few months in the United States, that there are lives at stake when we fail to listen, when we fail to imagine another's humanity, another's dignity. And so this quote is really important to me. I underlined 4 here to amplify that listening isn't just a static thing. It's not static at all, in fact. But when we listen for, we listen with, we listen alongside, and maybe most importantly, we listen as ourselves, right? Not as empty vessels, but from a positionality that allows us to listen and miss certain things at certain times. And the more we can be aware of that, being attuned and not being attuned, the better off we will be. And that's why I think it's an ethical practice, and one that can cultivate equity and social justice. So I'm going to shift just for a few more minutes and talk about building listening capacity specifically in the English classroom. So one of the ideas in the book is this idea of listening in print. On the screen here are some of the books that I spend most of my time talking about in Race Sounds. And I want to share with you a couple of lines from a few of them. So Toni Morrison's Jazz is one book that I write about. And this is the first line of that book from the novel. And when I teach this line, inevitably, students struggle with what to do with the first word before the comma. They think it's a typo or a word that they've just never seen and they don't know how to pronounce it. So Toni Morrison talked about this as well, but writers, critics, myself have talked about that first utterance as what we call colloquially a sucking of the teeth, like that, right? So it's a sort of punctuation that is not a word, but it is a sound that is a human sound, and it underlines that idea of the certainty of the narrator. So I know that woman, right? There's some attitude there. The other idea that I actually came up with this morning as I decided to use this line in this presentation was that STH could be, I was thinking the sound of a manual typewriter hitting paper, which I thought was really cool. I did, and it's not one that struck me before, but I'd share it here and you can let me know what you think of that. So this is one example of a novel. You open it up to the first page, and all of a sudden, as a reader, you're positioned differently than a scanner with your eyes. You're asked to hear and decipher what this word says in a different way than the way that you decipher and hear what the rest of the words in that sentence say. The second one that I'll share is from, again, Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God. It's a novel that's near to my heart. Phoebe's hungry listening helped Janie to tell her story. And what I'm proud of about Race Sounds is that I am, I think, still the only person who really spent a lot of time talking about Phoebe as an important figure in the book. So instead of focusing in on Janie telling her story, I really sort of unpacked what it meant to have Phoebe present as a hungry listener. And so she went on to think back to her young years and explain them to her friend in soft, easy phrases, while all around the house, the nighttime put on flesh and blackness. So asking your students, if we could just imagine Janie and Phoebe on that porch, talking to each other, not having seen each other for a long time, what is it about that posture that Phoebe presents that lets Janie know that she has a hungry listener before her? How can we imagine that? How can we replicate that for each other? Right? Something that I encourage students to think about. What does hungry listening sound like? How do you perceive that activity? And then the third example I'll share is from another of my favorites. I have a lot of favorites, that's why I wrote about them. The Cheney'sville incident, David Bradley. If you haven't read this book, definitely read it. The first lines of the novel reads, "Sometimes you can hear the wire, hear it reaching out across the miles, whining with its own weight, crying from the cold, panting, humming." And then it goes on to the end. "Then as the rasping of your breathing fades and the hammering of your heartbeat slows, you can hear the whining, crying, panting, humming, moaning like a live thing." There's so much sonic energy and life in this passage. And the address of the you, sometimes you can hear, right, puts us in this position where the novel's actually speaking to us. So it's calling on us, I argue, to be listeners to the text as opposed to just passive. Not that reading is passive, but as our students practice it, you're not just scanning the page in this detached way, right? But you're actually being called into it. What we learn later on in the novel, and this is not a spoiler, but part of what the main character is tracking as a historian is a group of runaway slaves in Pennsylvania. And this line of the telephone wire becomes a figure for them on the wind, right? So we hear these people throughout, and then we finally encounter them in different ways throughout the novel. Students also struggle with hearing this passage because they can't imagine a phone having a wire. And without my parents, I wouldn't have either. So I think, getting them to think about technology and the way technology is positioned here as a listener and a recorder of human sound to listen to is really striking. So I'm going to quickly just share with you a couple of assignments I give students to help them build listening capacity. One is a listening journal. I asked students when I was teaching high school English, and I ask students now in my graduate programs too, to keep a listening journal. So some examples of prompts: what does your writing sound like? I wrote in the book that I had one student write about the way when she was in middle school, she liked to crumple paper and then uncrumple it and then write on it, because she liked the sound that it made when she wrote across the paper, as opposed to writing on a smooth surface. A lot of students talk about the typing of their keyboard. I asked them to send a sound from their world in writing. So write in a way that's so sonic that your reader can't help but listen to it, right? So building that capacity in these low stakes ways. And then sketch and describe your own sound suit. But what I mean by sound suit is this. Nick Cave is an African-American artist who takes found objects and creates these wearable suits that when the person in them moves, makes sound. And so I'll call your attention to the one on the right, which is of twigs. He started this practice after the Rodney King beating back in 1994. And he was walking in a park and looked down and saw twigs and thought about the police baton, and he started collecting them and then made this suit. And he talks about it as a space where he collects violence and remakes it into art, but also as a suit of protection, right? And so thinking about the ways in which the sonic art that we make carries with it traces of the world, right? And how we want to remake the world in a different way. My students compose audiography. So thinking about not so much writing these long reams of who I am, but really capturing sound in a way that allows them to think about who they are, how they want people to listen to them, and then also how the audience can show up to listen as well. These are just a few responses from some of my high school students specifically, after going through their listening class with me. And then the last piece I'll leave you with is the idea that you can use listening not just in your listening classroom, but with colleagues as well. So if you're a department chair or you're in any position where you're giving peer or other kinds of feedback to your colleagues, to think about how you can amplify listening as a way to give feedback to people in a way that allows them to hear it. To change up your observation practice, right? Instead of just watching what's happening in class, taking note of what is said, what kinds of questions are asked, who speaks, who is silent. We talk about curriculum audits all the time. The root of the word audit is hearing, it's audio. And so what would it look like? What might we find out differently if we were to listen to our curricula? And then what conversations are you bringing to your students' ears in the texts you curate as curriculum? So instead of thinking about individual, who are the authors that are represented here, also thinking about how are they speaking to each other? How are they listening to each other? How are they in conversation? And then I've used listening in meetings as well. How do we talk about students? So I've done things where with the faculty knowing, I've done things where I've listed descriptors when we've talked about student learning, when we've talked about professional learning, when we mention metaphors about the ways in which we work and learn. And doing that kind of text mining through listening can give us an ear in, so to speak, into our communities, into our schools in ways that other modes seem to fail to do. So I'll leave you with these questions. And these aren't questions for us to answer now, but they are ones to take with you and to think about in your practice. What do equitable, inclusive, and anti-oppressive classrooms and pedagogical practices sound like? How might engaging our classrooms and schools as sonic sites resonate with listening possibilities help us get there? How, and this is specifically for the English teachers, how does listening lead to questions about what stands as a book, a text, writing, the English class, or literacy? How do we engage students in that query? And how might we tune into our teaching and leadership practices differently through listening? So thank you for listening. And I'm going to stop share and just open up for questions.
Well, I want to start by saying thank you. I would just like to sit for a minute to try to digest so much of it. But something came to mind. I think you might have mentioned this in the earlier session. And that is, I think it's an interesting, and it's kind of almost a paradox, is for teachers who seem to have a singular measure of students' involvement in a class, which is the student's voice. So if we want to know, is the student engaged in the class, we typically measure it by, well, are they speaking up in class? You have any thoughts on how do you address that paradox?
Yeah, I talked about that briefly in the other session.
Yeah, right? Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, but it's definitely one that's worth going into, right? Because we assess students on participation largely based on vocal utterance, and then the quality of that utterance, right, is the next step to that. And so, but if we're only assessing that, then students know that that is what's important. And so that's what they're going to focus on. They're going to sit and be engaged in a way that says, how can I get myself in here to get my points for the day, right? But what is it about our practice that can help cultivate students' willingness to understand that participation is also the listening piece? Because if everyone's talking and nobody's listening, then those voices become devalued.
Yeah.
They really don't go anywhere, right? So a couple of quick practices that I've used in my classrooms that I found have helped. One is to really wait before you call on students. So the first hand that goes up is not the first one that speaks, and giving everyone time to sit. Also, when a conversation is happening, having pause points. So literally saying, I want us to pause right now, and I want us to think back over what our colleagues have said. Take note, and then when you offer a comment, I want it to be one that has been connected to something you heard from someone else. I want you to build, right? So that idea of participation as building, and the only way we can build is not coming in with the thing we're going to say and then we're done for the day, but it's actually about allowing questions and understanding to emerge in the moment. And so I think the more that we can communicate to students that we value that we take time to develop that capacity in class, the more they'll take to heart that listening is actually really important. And hopefully we will see more of it, right? We were talking off screen earlier about the challenge of listening through Zoom, which is a whole other, right? So this adds another layer of how do you assess listening in this mode? And so thinking about how to democratize this space, everything from the chat feature to open unmutings, right? To selective muting, those kinds of things can be helpful. But I would encourage teachers to really think about what they need to do in their classrooms to shift that practice, even for themselves, from counting participation as I do speak to really thinking about other behaviors we want to cultivate in the classroom towards effective citizenry, really.
Right. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on that. And I was teaching in my English class yesterday, juniors and seniors, a book called Annihilation, and we were talking about writing and this sense that writing or written language is a mode of intelligence that often is used by humans to signify their dominion, right, over the natural world or over animals. It's in Genesis, in our Judeo-Christian tradition. And I'm thinking about, when you were talking, I was thinking about that and thinking about, as an English teacher, how I teach poetry and how I teach prose. And I think for a lot of English teachers, there's this notion that because poetry has such a strong oral tradition that, of course, we should be reading aloud or playing with the language and the sound of the language in the classroom. But when you turn to prose, there is, as you said, often this privileging of the written word, the paragraph, and around with this text. And I'm thinking a lot about intelligences and how animals, we know, often have, I'm a big cat lover, they are much more attuned as listeners in many ways. They really value that kind of intelligence. And so I was wondering, how you might talk about the ways that we can work with students when teaching prose, passages that aren't necessarily directly about listening. I'm thinking of Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, and your wonderful example, the second example, but also your first example where Morrison it's not a passage about the act of listening, but you want your students to think about what the words themselves sound like. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if you could probe that a little bit more, because I know for us, like, we read it up the passage aloud and then we analyze it. But is there more we might do?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I saw Maddie nodding her head as well about the difference between how we approach teaching the novel,
yes,
right, and poetry. I think novels bring a different challenge to us as readers anyway, the longer sustained, both sustained and broken attention, because you don't read a novel in one sitting. I mean, my daughter has, but right, but you typically don't, right? You read it sort of serialized, right? And so thinking about how we sustain listening is a very different mode of listening as reader than a poem that you might even be able to see on one page. What I would say is that I think a couple of things. One, historically, so if we go back to sort of the Middle Ages, written texts were understood by readers in that moment as embedding sound. So print was in a way a trace of sound. And so if you historically gone print in that way, then it means that all print has within it this capacity to have sound in some kind of way. So I think that's kind of a cool historical thing to share with kids, right? Especially when we think about our world where we're texting and emailing and the tone of that print goes away. Right. And so getting them to actively think about the importance of tone in any written thing can help them, I think, in a lot of ways. Right. But I also think expanding our understanding of what it means to read And that's what I meant by that question of what it means to develop literacy. That reading literacy is often codified by what we take in through the eye and how we can decode words. We can to say them out loud also, but to sort of read them in our heads, right? To make, and then make sense of them. What if we helped students understand that one's position towards what they read is meant ideally to be one of a fully sensing being? So writers don't write for you to just look at what they write, right? They all bring these worlds to life. I mean, we see it in things like Harry Potter, right? Or Lord of the Rings, where you then end up seeing it on the big, the screen, and all of a sudden you're, oh my goodness, that and the page, yes, I can see that, right? They put it all there for you to then visualize it. So I think really sort of honing into the respect for the worlds that our authors give us in whatever genre they're in, and then asking students to think about, how is this text calling you to be fully present, right? Not only as a listener, but even as, I mean, sometimes they miss seeing things, right? But also, what does it mean to feel, like the texture of language? What does it mean to even think about, you know, the book as it appears to you has a life before that's sort of messy drafting? What does it mean to sort of want to try to tie back into that, right? But that's a long way of saying that, you know, the history of print, right? Plus the hope that a lot of authors talk about, that people come to their books as full beings, and in a way where, as Baldwin says, fiction is one of the best places to practice what it is to be good in real life,
Yeah.
right? And if that's true, then how do we bring our full sensory beings to that effort?
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Nicole, early on, you were talking about we listen with, or we listen to, and then you ended by saying we listen as, and we listen as with a positionality, that positionality can cause us to miss. And I wonder, I mean, so often that positionality, there is an unconscious bias that leads to lack of awareness of. And to what extent do you find the English classroom is a place where we need to do that work of one's understanding of their positionality?
So I will say that I believe this should happen in all classrooms, but as a trained English teacher and lover of literature, I do think that we have some unique opportunities to engage students in thinking about who they are and how they show up in the world, and how systems inform who they are and how they experience the world. It's really interesting when you read a book like, let's take Moby Dick, okay, for instance, where, you know, you have these sort of, Ishmael declares himself as unwritten to the last. His body is this sort of, you know, unlike Queequeg, who's overwritten, right? Ishmael could be anybody, anywhere, right? We position in that text, or we see positioned in that text, I should say, an identity, a historical identity in historic time, whiteness, maleness, the traveler, the American, as unwritten and unimpacted by systems and by other people's view of them. We also see people who are clearly framed by other people's view of them, right? So I think that in calling that to students' attention and then asking them to reflect on their own identities can be, you know, all the literature we read have characters in them that are positioned in certain ways. How might we sort of make explicit that positioning, particularly in texts that take that positioning for granted? Toni Morrison, I'm looking here because I have it right here, playing in the dark. Toni Morrison talks about that idea of, right, the specter of Blackness and of whiteness living in these texts without remark, right? And so what does it mean to use the English classroom as a space where we unpack what has traditionally been thought of as the unmarked, in order to think about, in our current day, how notions of Blackness, of difference, of whiteness sort of show up for us in our world, and what we need to do to address, recast, dismantle, right? All those things that we're talking about more and more in this current day. So I think that positionality is really important. I also think that understanding that we cannot listen to others as empty people, that listening does have a filter. But being aware of where our biases might be showing up for all of us, working against some of those biases, right? Getting curious about another's positionality can be really helpful in terms of making sure that we're getting to listen to things and people and ideas and possibilities that we otherwise miss because of our primary positionality.
Thanks. And thanks also for qualifying. This isn't just for English classes.
Oh, yes. No, yeah, because often, and I say that because I know this work often falls in the humanities, English and history, languages, right? Because that work is seen as culture work, and thinking about the ways in which all disciplines are situated, and who is amplified in them and who isn't, is really, and what we count as evidence across the curricula, right, is really important. So.
And I think there was, Nicole, I think you can see it as well. There was a great question from the audience there about not necessarily looking for a magic bullet, but a successful metric to measure the leaning in that's inherent in true listening. Can you see that question? Okay.
Oh, yes, I do. Thanks, Alan. How you doing? I know Alan. So thanks for the question. So there are a few things that I'm actually working on to develop ways of measuring that metric. But one of the things that I've done in the context of high school, working with teachers, is actually getting them to look at their rubrics around participation and to do kind of a text mine, to listen in print to that rubric, and to ask what are the behaviors that they are amplifying in that rubric, which means that that's what they want students to master and show every day. And then what are those things that are missing, right? So not just looking at the rubric as is, but really asking yourself, what is missing from what I'm suggesting as participation that I would want to see, right? And linking that to the purpose of your class, right? Away from the purpose of, I have this content and I need them to learn it. But ultimately, what is in this case, what is your English class for? What is chemistry class for? What is calculus for, right? I believe that all those things are valuable, but they're valuable beyond the discipline themselves. And so I would urge people to sort of expand their net in terms of what they consider when they put a rubric together around measuring participation, so that things like listening, even presencing, right? That idea of how do you signal to people, even through your body language, through and through the screen, these kind of signals, or, whatever sort of norms that you identify, that you are seeing presencing and engagement in action. So I know that's not a satisfactory answer because I don't have a rubric to turn over, but I think that those are some questions to consider as we begin to develop these kinds of tools for ourselves.
Nicole, that's like such important work that we're doing in schools. And well, you wrote this, you said, we emerged as a nation by declaring our independence, yet we developed a speaking voice at the expense of listening with a public purpose. We are unaware of the conversations we miss when we speak. And I think about that in the context of going into a debate in which we've had to mute our presidential candidates. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the impact you see on that sort of for students in schools.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is the question of the moment, right? With long and short-term ramifications. We have a lot of models in the world of the speaking over, or listening to respond, which is a kind of listening that has its value, right? In its own way, but we seem to only have developed that. And listening, as we know from this conversation, is a range of repertoires, right, that we've only tapped into just a little bit. I think in terms of the debate stage, that piece, the right to listen, kept coming to mind for me every debate I watched, because, and including the town halls, which were pitted against each other at the same time on different networks, right? And so, I think one question I kept asking was, what space are we giving to our citizenry to listen in order to make informed decisions? What space do we allow for that? We also know, though, and this is with a caveat, political listening is the hardest listening to do. Or I should say, listening in a political context is the hardest thing to do. Yuri Hassan, who I write about in the book, but I'm also I'm doing some work with him, he runs this listening lab, and he studies the ways in which we connect across neuro wavelengths when we listen to each other. So if I'm telling a story, or I'm talking right now and you're listening to me, there's a moment where if our brains sync up because you're really paying attention, your brain will begin to mimic my brain patterns. And then as you go deeper, your brain patterns actually begin to anticipate mine. So you kind of finish my sentences in terms of a neuroscience sense, right? Which is so cool, right? So we're all creating these invisible networks and communities when we listen to each other. So it's really fascinating, right? Where this breaks down, he says, is in the political arena. And part of it is the way that we are set up, right? It's this or this. You're either with this person or this person. There's all this room in the middle that we don't get to delve into in the context of a debate stage. And really, by the time we get to debates, people have largely already made up their minds. And so one thing to think about is, how do we provide authentic spaces for listening away from the urgency of, I'm going to cast my vote in a few weeks, right? In order to cultivate that muscle, so that when we get to moments like an election season, right, that we have that listening capacity to bring to bear, right? It's in part what some of us are worried about in our schools, right? After November 3rd, what is November 4th going to be like at school? Either way, what is it going to be like? And a lot of us are nervous about that. But if we build these capacities for community engagement and citizenship over time, how might that give us some answers as to what it might be like after, such a sort of tense and divided moment?
Well, I hate to be the one to say that we're over time.
Oh.
I will tell you, what we all hope for is our students to look at the clock and say, really? When the class is over. But you have done that. It's riveting. It's important. I think what Mike had said, I want to reiterate thanking you for extending it, the importance of this beyond the English classroom. I just feel as though it has to be the ethos of all of what we consider school. And if our schools are going to contribute the way they should, the way they ought to our democracy, then this surely is central to that. So thank you so much. As an old Klingenstein fellow, it just warms my heart to see the leadership that you're bringing to that program. Thanks so much for that.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody off screen. Thanks to the panelists for really making this what we hope it would be, is our own kind of little public discourse here. And this is going to be taped and produced, if you will, and that will be ready, I think, in a week or two, which allows us to take this to even a more expanded public discourse, perhaps to your faculties, to your school community. I think it would be really intriguing to bring it to your students, and whether that just be Nicole's introduction, or whether it's the whole conversation, and get students listening and involved in that way. So Nicole, thanks so much, and thanks to all of you. And yeah, and the book is available.
Yeah.
Yes, I put it on the, I'll repost that link that has the resources, but the link to the book is there. Nicole, the link to your presentation, and the link to, I just found a quick TED Talk by Yuri that you mentioned. I couldn't find anything else, but if you want to add to it, that list of resources is there for people who are following along, and for the panelists, if you want to follow up on anything that Nicole mentioned.
Great. And you can also feel free to share the PDF reading. It's the intro to the book and a chapter. So if people, at least want to be able to see that,
Okay,
I'm happy
yeah.
to share that with a larger audience. Yeah.
That is there too. So there's
great.
the book,
Good.
your presentation, and then what happens in the brain we hear stories.
Okay, great.
Great. Great.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.